My name is Bob Chen. I'm director of CISEIN. You can see the full name up there. We're a center within the Earth Institute here at Columbia. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this session. It is an interesting topic since, as I'm sure all of you know, the SDG is a global agreement. The 2030 Development Agenda is a global agenda, and that means that the developed world is actually committing itself to meet these goals. And therefore, a really interesting question is how prepared and how will the developed world be able to meet the goals in 2030 if they don't already meet them. And that's the topic of this panel discussion. So we're pleased this afternoon to have some very distinguished panelists, including all but one of the people listed on the screen. Unfortunately, the ambassador from Mexico will not be joining us this afternoon, but our first speaker, first panelist will be Ambassador Deborah Birx, the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and U.S. Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy from the U.S. State Department. The second speaker, Ambassador Heiko Thoms from the Deputy Permanent Representative of Germany to the United Nations, Christian Kroll from Bertelsmann Stiftung, which as you'll hear about, has done a study of exactly this issue, and I noticed there were copies of the study out on the table, on the resource table outside. So if you're quick, you can get a copy of it. Guido Schmidt-Traub, who's the Executive Director of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Simon Scott, Senior Counselor from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Development Assistance Committee. So given the time, we won't go into detailed bios. Each person has 5 minutes to make kind of an opening statement, and then we will take questions from the audience. I guess you're used to this. You have to write them on an index card. I'll be using cards, not Twitter. So we'll take as many questions as we can given the limited time after the statements. So please join me in welcoming the panel, and we'll start with Ambassador Birx.
Well, good afternoon. I think we all heard from that last panel a very exciting piece about leapfrogging. And you can leapfrog when you don't have the baseline. And so when you talk about leapfrogging in telecom and you talk about leapfrogging in banking, and particularly some of the developing countries, it was possible because the hard wires weren't there and the ATMs weren't there. And we want to figure out a way how you leapfrog in the health system and the health SDGs, and really ask ourselves every day, are we creating the health system of the 20th century or the health system of the 21st century? And I think that's really a very open question. And are we keeping up with the demographics in Africa and already the accomplishments of the MDGs? So I think it caught us all a little bit by surprise how successful we had been in some of the MDGs collectively, and the improvement in the under 5 survival, and realizing now we have 30% more young people between the ages of 15 and 24 in a lot of the developing world. And from my perspective, who works on HIV/AIDS, that's a very concerning figure when women are at the highest risk group for getting HIV/AIDS. So you can see just by numbers, even though we've had a substantial decline in HIV incidence rates, because of the increased number of individuals at risk, we're headed to 28 million new infections in the next 15 years during the SDG period. And obviously that's not sustainable or affordable. So how do we figure this out together? And I think I just want to make a few points related to data. So I come out of the bench science world, where data was king, and moved into the program management world, where data and data analytics has not always been king. We sometimes talk about best practices, and best practices has often meant that someone had the initiative to write it up and put it in a brochure, and that became the best practice. But what really data do we have to show that is a true best practice in having an impact and the outcomes that we really want? So we're trying to put our data where our mouth is, and we've been very aggressively putting our data up on pepfar.net and pepfar.gov. You can go there and find our dashboard and really understand what PEPFAR is trying to do in partnership with host countries to really make a difference in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And in doing that, we realize that, you know, there's a tyranny of averages. So if you look at the country level, you can think you're doing great, and then when you look at the province level, you're thinking, well, maybe not so great. And then you look at the district level and the site level, and you realize that there's whole populations that have been underserved or not served at all, despite a decade of really aggressive work within the host countries with PEPFAR and the Global Fund. And as we start doing this very granular level analysis, we're finding, like in Haiti, an entire part of the island that was completely missed, and 10,000 patients were out there who had never received treatment or received prevention of mother-to-child transmission. So I think the other piece I want to leave you with is, as you work in this granularity and you look it down at the site level, because it's really about the client that's receiving services and ensuring that they're receiving quality services, you begin to realize that we have created pockets of inequity between service delivery sites. And we didn't keep up with the urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you live in a rural area, you actually have better access to services than if you live in an urban area that's highly overburdened and the distance between the actual health centers is even greater. And it's this kind of mapping and analytics that we find to be incredibly important. Because as we started working with the data, we have amazing data people who can look at Excel spreadsheets and get excited and understand what it means. And then we have a lot of other rest of us who really want to see it graphically or visually, because we want people to understand the data in order to make it actionable. And so that's what, if we're talking about the SDGs, we have to be talking about granularity of data and really the outputs and impact part of data, and then creating data visuals that people can understand and the public sector within each of the countries have access to. So we can really have advocacy around that. So we're actually in a partnership right now for sustainable development and data utilization as part of the data revolution. We're excited about it. We're excited to be part of the data revolution. Our team just got back from Kenya, where Kenya is taking on the data revolution in a horizontal way, which is the way we need to do it. Because health impacts education, education impacts health. They all impact poverty and the ability to be lifted out of poverty. And so this kind of horizontal access to data that transcends, we used to talk about integration at the health system, and now we're talking about integration across all the platforms to understand where we're achieving our goals, where we're not achieving our goals, and stop looking at things as averages and just means and medians, and go back to seeing whether a young girl in Kisumu, Kenya, who's 15, has access to secondary school, quality secondary school, has access to HIV testing, has access to prevention messages, and has a community wraparound where we understand when she's 21, there's a job available for her. And so these are the kinds of pieces we would like to be part of bringing together. But I want to leave you with where I started, is we need to be asking ourselves every day in partnership with our countries whether we're creating this health system that will work for them in the 21st century in an urbanized and highly populous countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a geographer and data manager, scientist, I really like to hear those kinds of messages. And thank you for making it so brief. So why don't we move on, Ambassador Thoms?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I have to apologize for my voice and the cough. Usually I get sick after high-level week. This year I got sick shortly before, so sorry for that. Secondly, thank you for inviting me. I think this is very timely. Timely also because I am, of course, just ahead of the visit of the Chancellor, supposed to be someplace else and prepare, but this gave me the opportunity to sneak out and be here at this event, so thank you. But it's also, of course, very timely from a German perspective, just to say that from a personal point of view at the beginning. From a German perspective, we are at the moment faced with a refugee crisis, and before I say more about that, we are very much aware that this is something, if you look at Syria, sub-Saharan Africa, which has been a problem for many countries in other parts of the world for many, many years. Only now this has struck us in this manner, but it's a crisis nonetheless. And of course, and that's why I say the SDG Summit is timely, of course you can look at this crisis on many different levels, but it's also something you can look at from an angle that it's the lack of sustainable development which has led to what we are now faced with. Well, I've followed this for the last few years here. We are excited that the SDG Summit will finally take place. It has been a long way. Germany has been involved in many stages of the process. Our former president was involved in the high-level panel. We were part of the open working group together with France and Switzerland, so it's great that we will finally see the outcome at the end of this week. But of course, the real work only starts now. I'm sure you have heard that many times before today, but what really is important now is implementation, and together with the implementation I always have to mention monitoring and review. And this is something which is in a certain way, if I look at the title of this segment, also it's very new that OECD countries find themselves in a situation that they will also be scrutinized. This is something, by the way, which we always have advocated for. It was one of the most important points in our agenda, that this agenda should be truly universal, should be a global agenda, and that all countries should be subjected to the same standards. So we think this is a success in itself. So it's more than legitimate to ask the question whether OECD countries are fit for implementing the SDGs. And the study we are going to hear about clearly demonstrates that OECD member states still have a lot of work ahead of them. So I was talking about the fact that implementation goes together with monitoring and review. This is for two reasons. First of all, we have to see through monitoring review mechanisms that everything remains on track, but also we need to always ask ourselves whether things need to be adjusted on the way if that should be necessary. So two factors in our view will be crucial for an effective and inclusive review. First, the availability of data and state-of-the-art statistics, which is not a given in many countries of the world. And second, analysis and exchange on the findings. So it goes without saying that Germany is very strongly in support of a strong follow-up and review mechanism. At the same time, a review process offers, in our view, the best opportunity to learn from one another how to best deliver on the SDGs, on the SDG goals. I'll just talk very briefly about the German example, because we have some experience on the national level with monitoring and review mechanisms. We have, since 2002, a national sustainable development strategy, and this will, by the way, also provide the essential framework for the implementation of the 2030 agenda, which will then be integrated in our national sustainable development strategy. In our view, the strategy, the monitoring mechanism is a key factor for success. Every 2 years, the German Federal Statistical Office publishes an indicator report to provide information on the extent to which sustainability targets have been reached or not. And this monitoring then is complemented by a review process. The federal government publishes a progress report every 4 years. The next one is due in the fall of 2016. And I can tell you that this has been very closely followed by the public on many instances, and it was not always pleasant for the government, but it's good that this is so, because we need this constructive criticism in order to get better. And we'll continue to follow up on this in the future. On the international level, we focus on transparency and also on mutual learning. We have submitted our Sustainable Development Strategy to international peer reviews twice so far. And the OECD will provide support to its member state as an established network in which governments can work together to share experiences and seek solutions to common problems. In our view, one of the OECD's particular strengths is its own peer review system. I'm sure we're going to hear about that a little more, so I don't go into that. Let me just mention that a very important element for us is that the recommendations resulting from such peer reviews often help governments to garner support at home for controversial measures. And this is something we also have to bear in mind. So we think these mechanisms need to be transformed to the global level. That's very important. And in this regard, we are particularly happy with the strong leadership role which is given to the high-level political forum, HLPF, which will be confirmed in the outcome of the agenda by the end of this week. So we are very interested in sharing our experience with other member states, and in this respect, we also want to be a good role model. So let me just say one thing. We are now very concretely looking into the possibility of being one of the first countries to be subjected to the review. So we are studying that possibility. And the second thing is, as I mentioned, it's not a given that in all countries statistical data are readily available, as they may be in most OECD countries, or all OECD countries. So we are very happy to assist countries which don't have the necessary institutions in place in creating those institutions, helping them with collecting the data and in measuring in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I guess we'll hear about other countries who are taking that kind of leadership role shortly. So our next speaker, Christian, are you going to do it from here, or do you want to?
Do you have the remote control?
It's up on the podium. So.
Yeah, that'd be great. No, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today, particularly in this room. I remember the last time I was in this very room is exactly 10 years ago. At the time, I was an intern at the United Nations, and of course, no such internship would be complete without attending a public lecture by Professor Sachs. So I'm really glad about the invitation today. Now, I brought a couple of slides. Thank you for pointing out the study. We have 400 free copies, so I hope you can grab one, unless otherwise there's also the PDF on the internet, of course. Now, one of the key lessons of the MDGs was that no problem in this world can be tackled in isolation. And therefore, this universality of the agenda is a key issue. And Kofi Annan, in the foreword to this study, which was published 2 weeks ago, says it very clearly. The focus for industrialized nations must remain, of course, on ending extreme poverty in the most desperate regions of this planet. However, the SDGs go further than that. They will demand domestic reforms, and we need reform debates in the industrialized nations on more social justice and sustainability in those places. They have to become the leading examples in those fields. And what's important to remember about the SDGs is, of course, that they are not legally binding. So it'll be up to us, citizens, civil society, to make sure that governments don't lose their focus on the commitment that's going to be made on Friday. And that's precisely why we teamed up with SDSN, and again, thanks to everyone involved in this exercise, to raise awareness in the industrialized nations for the fact that these goals are actually about the way we in the industrialized nations live, the way we consume, the way we produce. And the feedback so far has been tremendous. We had media reports in basically every OECD country where the countries were keen to see how well prepared they are for the SDGs. And we were brave enough, or you could say foolish enough, to also calculate a readiness index for the SDGs. And the Nordic European countries, in terms of our assessment of 34 snapshot indicators for the new 17 goals, actually perform best here. And we point out for every country where the respective strengths and weaknesses are, such as in the case of the United States here. Now, what our study shows is that actually most of the OECD countries are not on a good way in many goals. In fact, they're on track to fail a lot of the commitments, and they are a long way off from serving as role models for sustainable development as defined by the SDGs. For example, half of all OECD countries have a share of renewable energy below 11%. Right now. Netherlands, UK, less than 4%. Sweden, Norway, on the other hand, 50%. So it is possible. We can see examples that it is possible to achieve sustainable development. In 23 OECD countries, now you know one goal deals with inequality, but in 23 OECD countries, the top 10% now earn as much as the bottom 40%. In the US, it's actually 1.7 times as much. So our economic systems in the industrialized countries exacerbate the trend of a growing gap between rich and poor, and that really shouldn't be the example we set to the rest of the world. Germany does pretty well in the comparison. It's on number 6. However, every German produces 600 kilograms of waste every year. So that's, despite the recycling that we do, still something where we have to increase our efforts. Also, only 5 countries we've identified already fulfill the target of 0.7% of official development assistance that they pledge to. So there is a lot to learn across industrialized countries. So what needs to happen in the next 15 years is a peer learning process where we look at the good examples in all the goals, and we have identified those best practices and really engage in a process of peer learning. For example, if you look at Sweden, how they managed to reduce their low levels of greenhouse gas emissions since 2006 by another third, and that's really worthy of emulation. And that's due to, of course, an awareness in the public that climate change is an important issue, but also providing financial incentives. So Professor Sachs mentioned the CO2 tax earlier. So it provided incentives in Sweden, we can see that, for the use of biomass in heating systems, for example, instead of fossil fuels, and that reduced the output there. Now, let's move on to the implementation in the next 15 years. Think about derive strategies based on those best practices, and it's an exercise that we all should engage in, not just the policymakers that signed the agreement on Friday, but also businesses, of course, civil society, students, universities. If you're a Columbia University student and you fancy a semester abroad next year in Berlin at the Hertie School of Governance, which is one of your partner universities, feel free to join my course on implementation strategies for sustainable development goals. That should be where we direct our thinking in the next 15 years, how to learn from the best practices in sustainable development. Now, my last sentence should really be about the ambition. Many people were cynical at the start of the MDGs, saying, well, this is not going to help. And there's a lot of cynicism around right now as the SDGs are being signed. But the experience of the last 15 years really shows that we can be ambitious and we must be ambitious. Because if the MDGs helped developing countries, for instance, to halve child mortality rates over 15 years, then just imagine what the industrialized countries, with all their richness, with all their technology, can do in the next 15 years in order to achieve more sustainability and social justice. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. And I think since it is a global agenda, I think one of the lessons to keep in mind is that we not solve these problems just by transferring them somewhere else. There's no other place to transfer them. So our next speaker, Guido.
Thank you very much. This is a great discussion now, looking at how the SDGs actually translate into national discussions, national processes. If we go back to the global level, I think there are three important lessons that we should ponder and address from the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals have advanced the use of data quite significantly, but there are three huge gaps I want to just focus on briefly. One is we're still living in a world when governments come together this year to review progress on the Millennium Development Goals. They're looking at poverty data from 2010. That's not useful for practical policy making. The gaps and the lags in a lot of key development statistics are just way too long. And there's really there's no justification for this. This needs to be resolved if the SDGs are to become a scorecard and a management tool. And that's really what they are, because ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, put out a nice report, I think today or yesterday, showing that on every single SDG we're off track. Rich countries, poor countries. And so this is of course the reason why we need the goals, because we are off track. So we need to change course for that. The goals need to be a management tool. Second is, and the ambassador referred to this, the data is insufficiently disaggregated. We often don't even know well enough how women are doing relative to men. And this also applies to many OECD countries, let alone sort of more marginalized groups, the disabled and others. So this, if we want to take the leave no one behind agenda seriously, we need to look at disaggregation. The third one, I think this is particularly important for OECD countries, is we don't really have a clear sense of answering the question whether any of the OECD countries are on track, for example, towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions adequately. Because just looking at per capita emissions or even the share of renewable energy is not really helpful for answering that question. Because countries will need to transform their energy systems quite profoundly to get there. The same is true for agriculture. The same is true for the way in which we manage the food system, oceans, other things. These are profound transformations that will take a very long time to bear fruit. We need to have a much clearer understanding of how we assess effort, how we assess the strategies, the long-term pathways, and whether they are consistent with the long-term objectives. That, I think, is a critical objective, and I look forward to the next iteration of the Bertelsmann report. We'll be pleased to work with you to really try and drill down much more clearly whether countries are on track, if they implement their strategies, to achieving these transformations. The good news is that these are all challenges which can be addressed. The ambassador, you spoke about the progress in health, and this is always the example I cite in the development world. Health was a mess in the early 2000s. There wasn't really good data. The sector's been transformed completely. And this is not to say it's only because of data, but without data that wouldn't have happened. And what's really interesting, because we're at Columbia University here, a lot of that innovation happened outside the official systems. Much of the best health data is now kept at the University of Washington and the University of Louvain in Brussels. And it's being used everywhere. It just happened to be the most effective way to move forward. So we should learn from that. The other big news, of course, is technology. Technology has advanced. Hans Vestberg, others spoke about this in the preceding panel. Just as one example, colleagues have mapped every single health facility in Nigeria, every single education facility, every single water point in the space of 2 weeks. It costs a few $100,000, and this was done with the help of volunteers and mobile phone telephony. And the Nigerian government is now using this data, which is publicly available. You can go to Nigeria MDG portal, you can look it up, you can zoom down. They're using this now to even map out their power grid. We haven't really begun to grapple seriously with this, and the UN has so far not been very good at mobilizing technology for this. That needs to change. So at the SDSN, we want to do three things to support this data revolution. One is we're very, very pleased to work with the US government, Paul Zeitz is in the room, many others, on the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. I think this is a very, very exciting initiative. Thrilled that your president will formally announce it. This will be a loose federation of organizations trying to see how we can advance the use in particular of novel technologies. Second, we are setting up a thematic group on, or we have set up a thematic group on data for sustainable development. Bob, in his modesty, didn't mention that he's co-chairing this with 2 other people. What we want to do there is, again, very opportunistically, is to pinpoint some of the gaps that need to be filled. What are new ways of putting, in particular, how can we use geospatial information and map it with household surveys? How can we use data from mobile telephone companies, not to come up with the perfect metrics, but to get a better sense of trends. There's so many opportunities out there that we want to sink our teeth in. I think it's going to be a very exciting journey. Third, and finally, in the spirit of, the Bertelsmann report has shown the spotlight on what OECD countries are doing. We need to be doing the same on a number of key thematic priorities. So we look forward to working with a number of epistemic communities on, for example, having a broader global nutrition report that also looks at the environmental dimension of that. Health, again, has demonstrated how to do this. We need much better data for education, other areas. How can we mobilize thematic reporting, discussions, engagement around these issues? We're very grateful for the partnership from many. Incidentally, we're very grateful for the support from the German government, who's partnering with us on this effort, and look forward to working with all of you on this.
Thanks, Guido. And my center and SDSN are anchor partners in the global partnership, which is having its official launch on Monday. So I hope you follow those discussions next week. Last but not least, Mr. Scott from the OECD.
Thank you, Chair. I'm more popular than I thought, thanks. I must congratulate Guido and Christian first on this very good report. Copies are outside, as he says. You just go out those doors and sort of slide down into the coffee area to the right, lots of copies available. And it's not every day that we see a fully worked out methodology, all the data, country rankings and explanations for goals that haven't actually even been officially agreed yet. So well done. The OECD hasn't been quite as quick off the mark, I have to say, with this, but we have been preparing the ground for the SDGs for quite a few years. We've been working on multidimensional indicators of well-being for more than 10 years now. We have a publication, How's Life, which is going to have its 3rd edition coming out on the 15th of October. And this is based on the Better Life Index, which has 11 aspects of well-being. And we have indicators behind that, of course. And you can use different weightings for the different aspects of well-being and construct your own index to work out which countries are ahead and which have some time to make up. So the Better Life Index is rather similar to the SDGs in a number of respects. It covers fairly similar aspects of social and economic life. There are some differences. The Better Life Index emphasises more social connections and subjective well-being, whereas the SDGs have more on infrastructure and on basic services. And this is quite logical when you consider that the BLI was designed initially for industrial countries. We're adapting it to be of use to all countries, whereas the SDGs are designed for all countries and perhaps particularly for developing countries. So I've done a bit of a comparison of our rankings in a desperate attempt to catch up with you, Christian. And I find that the rankings are quite similar on the unweighted BLI. As I said, you can weight the factors as you like on the BLI and your index. But we find, though, that the BLI is closer to GDP per capita and, funnily enough, also closer to the rankings on the Human Development Index, which you might not necessarily expect. And we think that's got to do with the fact that the SDGs, and hence your study, is fairly heavy on the environment indicators. So 48 out of 169 targets are environment in the SDGs, so there's an environmental flavour to the SDGs as a whole, but we're going to be doing more work to get to the bottom of that. Anyhow, the OECD is also very active in finalising the official list of indicators to measure the SDGs. There's a big meeting coming up next month in Bangkok, and then the final agreement on which indicators will be used will be taken at the UN Statistics Commission in March next year. And we also have many policy tools that we think will help countries in achieving the SDGs. Our base erosion and profit shifting exercise helps countries get their fair share of corporate tax. We've got the policy framework for investment that helps countries get the most out of foreign direct investment. We're working on illicit financial flows. We're working on a lot of areas of policy. In fact, I have a massive brochure here full of details, which you can pick up from the same desk outside as Christian's very good report. All in all, our Secretary-General says that we expect to work with the United Nations and for the United Nations in helping achieve the SDGs. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak today. It's important to get to know what each other is doing on this topic, and I can only commend you again for your enviably early contribution to the debate. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So are we going to get a couple questions? I'm not sure who's collecting. If, I don't want to eat into the very important break time, and I know there's some parallel sessions coming up, but if there are going to be any questions, I don't see anybody.
Far right. The far right.
Right. Well, I'd like to take a couple of minutes. There was supposed to be a system for collecting the questions, but I'll take 2 questions. So the first people to get to each of those mics gets a question.
It's all about geography.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Solawale Olaide from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. The focus for this session is on the OECD. I would like to know what will be the next move, perhaps for non-OECD countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa. How are we going to go about measuring the indicators from those countries? And who will be leading what?
Right. Well, that's definitely an important question. Maybe Guido, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, briefly, this is of course a very big question. There is right now a process underway to define the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. My personal view, my personal hope is that they come up with a limited number of indicators, because if it's too many, it can't be tracked and it will not even be useful for communication purposes. So that's the first challenge. That process is underway. Formal adoption will be in March. What we now need to do, and there are various processes underway, to really think through carefully how that data can be collected. As I've mentioned, one is on an annual basis, and this is where new technologies really come in. We also need to invest more in household surveys and we collectively, the world. Second, how that data can be disaggregated more, and a lot of that will be done by pairing it with other forms of data. And 3, then how that data can support the national discussions. There is if I may add, a 4th point is we need to also have a real discussion on what are the important things that need to be measured. And mustn't fall into the trap of just taking the indicators that we currently have, for which we happen to have data, many of which are great, and take those as the indicator framework, because we may lose out on some really important priorities for which we'd better get data and just get organized. And this is, I think, one of the questions where the universities in particular need and must play a major role, because the official processes tend to fall back, with all due respect to the officials, all of us on this panel, the official processes tend to fall back on what they have on their shelves. And a lot of that is good, but the SDGs map out a very ambitious agenda, so we need to do a lot better. And that's something that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, together with our members, our thematic group, will try to sink our teeth into.
Thanks. And I'll just add, the meeting you were talking about is the meeting of the United Nations Statistics Commission in March next year. So that's a critical milestone. So I kind of said I'd do one from each mic. We'll see how the time goes, but go ahead at that mic.
Well, my question pertains to the financing of the SDGs itself, in which the OECD countries have a big role to play. Basically, at Addis, we saw that the question on tax reforms was given a big miss, and many developing countries were disappointed that the OECD countries would not let go of their privileges as far as tax agenda setting is concerned. So there's a lot of tax erosion that's happening in developing countries through illicit financing and transfer pricing and so on. And OECD countries have a big role to play so far as tax reform is concerned, and so that there's no erosion of taxes in developing countries, so they can generate the revenue they need to finance the SDGs. So what is happening on this front? Would like to know.
Sorry, it was hard to fully understand the question. Is there someone who would be willing to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I work for the OECD, but I can't speak for OECD countries. However, I think you've got a very good point. Unless the revenue is there, we can have all the targets we like, and they're not going to be achieved. And one of the main problems is there is not enough resources being mobilised to achieve even the MDGs, and certainly not the SDGs. Now, the OECD has itself many activities that are designed to help raise more domestic revenue and to ensure that developing countries get their fair share of international tax. I mentioned the base erosion and profit shifting work. That is designed to ensure that countries pay tax in the countries where they earn value. And we also have programs to increase the capacity of tax systems in developing countries. And we're working also on research to see how developing countries' levels of tax compare with OECD countries and what they can do to equitably raise that level without damaging the private sector activity, which is going to be necessary for them to develop across the board. Thanks.
Maybe just to add one point to this is the Addis agenda rightly points out that the overwhelming share of resources for financing the SDGs will come from the private sector and domestic resources. We're putting out a report next week that will show that, in fact, the domestic and private share together will be well over 90%, between 90 and 95% of total investment needs. The challenge is, and that was the fight in Addis, is developing countries find it quite hard to increase domestic resource mobilization. There are many internal issues which they need to address, their capacity issues, but there are also increasingly issues of international tax competition and others. And just to explain, the big fight that happened was that essentially the BEPS process which you've described, which is essentially the agenda setting process for transfer pricing, it is an OECD process. It is led and run by OECD countries. Developing countries are invited to some meetings, the G20 is. They have no say whatsoever, but it's a process that essentially sets rules for the entire world. And that obviously means that the process will not set these rules with a view towards the needs of developing countries. And this is a real governance question that needs to be addressed. The OECD has done that quite admirably for the tax forum, which is about tax transparency, where the governance now is one country, one vote, including developing countries. But for BEPS, this is a challenge, this is a can that's been kicked down the road, and my personal assessment is that it needs to be resolved in order to really mobilize domestic resources at the scale that's required for developing countries. And I think they've got a very fair point here.
Great. Okay, well, there was one person who was actually the second at the mic, so I'll let her, but then we're done. Go ahead. Quickly.
Sure. So my question is, I'm really curious, Simon, you mentioned measurements of well-being, And I'm curious of like how exactly well-being is planning to be measured, and if it's going to include subjective measurements of well-being or more just basic quality of life objective measurements, and then how to ensure the fidelity of the indicator information that's being collected from developing country contexts would be the second component to that.
It's me again, I suppose. Yes, well, there is an element of subjective well-being. That's one of the 11 aspects of the Better Life Index. Most of the others are in the social field. I mentioned social connections, employment and so on. Income is also part of it. Environmental aspects. On the environmental aspects, it's interesting that there's very little difference between rich and poor because it's only the outside environment that is concerned. It doesn't go into workplaces or conditions at home and so on. Now, there are 25 core indicators and about 30 additional indicators that are used to make up the Better Life Index, and they're more or less complete for OECD countries, but there is no way that they are complete for developing countries. And this gets back to the challenge that's been mentioned several times here. We need a much bigger effort on data in developing countries if the SDGs are going to work, because they do demand some of these same types of indicators. Thanks.
Christian, quickly.
Perhaps just very briefly, I don't know if you can go back to the final slide I had. If not, I'll just say it like this. So it's a widespread belief that subjective well-being or life satisfaction or happiness and sustainability are in a sort of a relationship of tension. In other words, a sustainable lifestyle is one where you have to forsake many things which make you happy. But actually in our study we ran a correlation of the performance of countries of the performance of countries in the Sustainable Development Goals and people's self-reported life satisfaction. And actually it turns out that those countries which do best in terms of sustainability as measured by the 17 goals are actually also the countries, yeah, that's it, where people are happiest. So.
Okay, great. Well, that's good to know. Anyway, please join me in thanking the panel. Sorry we couldn't go longer, but thank you very much to everyone.